I realize I might be a little late to the party on this story, but as with my D'Elia video, I wanted to wait a while to see how these events would play out, and it hasn't been disappointing. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, a few weeks ago the Los Angeles Times published an article documenting the accusations of several women against Bryan Callen. This is the same media outlet that interviewed several of the women who accused Chris D'Elia of grooming them through social media when they were underage. And in an article from July 1st, Amy Kaufman, the same writer who covered the D'Elia accusations, interviewed 4 more women who accused Bryan Callen of sexual misconduct and even assault. As with the accusations made against D'Elia, it is important to say that these are only accusations, and there is no hard evidence of them being true. However, the stories these women provided match a long-standing pattern of behavior that has been a part of Callen's persona for years. The tamest of the allegations came from a woman named Claire Ganshert, who was involved in a years-long extramarital affair with Bryan Callen. In addition to mentioning Callen's extreme and aggressive energy, Ganshert claimed that on one occasion, Bryan told her that women have a biological and primal desire to be raped. Not a good start, but the stories only escalate from here. Rachel Green, an employee of an American apparel store, claimed that in 2009, Callen pinned her against a wall while wearing a Speedo and started kissing her neck until she pushed him away and ran downstairs, a story that was corroborated by one of Green's coworkers. And again, while I can't attest to the veracity of this accusation, it's something I could see a guy like Callen doing. In the past, such as during a podcast with Chael Sonnen, he has gone into detail about how aggressive he can be with women, going so far as to say that even when women have told him no, and physically stopped him from touching them, he keeps going and tries to break the walls down, an act that he considers just being a man. There is also the accusation of Tiffany King. In 2017, King was going through a divorce and some financial hardships. During this time, she approached Callen, who she considered to be a friend, and asked if he could help her out. Callen declined but took King and his opener out to dinner. During the ride home from the restaurant, King claims that Callen offered her money and stage time in exchange for a blowjob. Of course, this is just an accusation. Curiously enough, King's accusation also bears a striking resemblance to a story that Whitney Cummings told about Bryan Callen. During one of her appearances on The Fighter and the Kid, Cummings laughed off the many times Bryan had sexually harassed her, such as an instance where Bryan exposed himself to Whitney while getting a ride from her, which Bryan attributed to an attempt to get a blowjob. Trying to get a blowjob from a female comedian in her car. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Moments later in the conversation, Whitney described Bryan as somebody who doesn't listen to the word no or take it seriously, to which Bryan sarcastically said he was a rapist. Cummings then explained that early in her friendship with Callen, she believed she would have to have sex with Callen because he wasn't going to take no for an answer. I'm sure people will deflect this kind of behavior as comedians exaggerating or lying for the sake of comedy, but Whitney was the first person to distance herself from Callen by deleting episodes of her podcast featuring Callen well before he had been accused of anything. It really gets the old noggin jogging. The most severe accusations, though, came from a woman named Catherine Fiore Tigerman. An actress and fellow Mad TV cast member, Tigerman claims to have known Callen since 1994. Tigerman moved to LA in 1999, where she met up with Callen again, and they became friends. After Tigerman landed a role in a TV pilot, Callen took her out to dinner, which Callen has confirmed. However, they have 2 very different stories about what transpired that night. Tigerman's story is a bit long, so I suggest you read the entire LA Times article. But to make a long story short, she claims that after having dinner with Callen, he wanted to see a movie, and then drove back to his house to look up showtimes. According to Tigerman, she used the bathroom at Callen's place, and when she was done, he was waiting for her in the doorway, at which point she claims Callen pushed her down onto his bed and started touching her against her will. She repeatedly told him no, but thinking she couldn't physically escape, she stopped pleading with him. When it was all over, Tigerman started crying, to which she claims Callen responded with, "Aw, come on, what am I? A big bad rapist? I'm not a big bad rapist. Come on, you're gonna be my girlfriend now. We need to get this out of the way." I know that sounds a bit over the top, but I can 100% picture Bryan saying the sentence. You know, in that annoying, overly affected voice he does. I would have tried to do it, but I can't do impressions. I'm just terrible at them, so you'll have to picture it in your mind. Callen has of course denied these allegations and said that his sexual encounter with Tigerman was consensual. On the other hand, Tigerman did tell a friend and her then boyfriend about her experience with Callen, and both corroborated the nature of her allegations. However, she did not attempt to pursue any legal action against Callen, preferring to try to move on with her life. As such, there are going to be people who dismiss the accusations out of hand and argue that Tigerman is trying to ruin Bryan Callen's life because she regrets cheating on her ex-boyfriend 20 years ago, or something of that nature. I understand that false accusations are made, and I think it's fair to be skeptical about anonymous accusations posted on social media. And unfortunately, like many issues involving sexual assault, this is largely a he said, she said situation with no physical evidence either way. But when somebody goes public and puts their story out there with nothing to gain, and multiple people backing them up, I have a hard time dismissing them completely. With all that said, the shit show that followed the Bryan Callen accusations has been a bizarre roller coaster ride of insanity. In the immediate aftermath of the LA Times article, Bryan Callen tweeted a message to his fans, in which he denied the accusations, blamed them on cancel culture, and stated that he would be releasing an emergency Saturday night edition of his podcast. And this is where the speculation started, because the emergency episode of TFATK that Callen promised never materialized. Furthermore, a few days later, Bryan posted a video message to his fans on Instagram addressing the accusations. There are a lot of interesting aspects of this video, but one that I think is worth noting in particular is how nervous Callen appears to be. The entire time he's speaking, his eyes are darting around in what can only be described as animal panic, and his mouth is forced into the rictus grin of a primate fear response. During the video, Bryan makes several odd statements, such as saying he's ignoring the advice of those around him to lay low, or wait for the news cycle to pass. He also walked back his claim from Twitter that the accusations were related to cancel culture or the Me Too movement. In fact, he even stated that he believed the Me Too movement was one of the most important movements of his lifetime. Which is pretty hilarious if you've ever listened to Bryan and Brendan mock Terry Crews for, as they put it, snitching on somebody who inappropriately touched him. The most interesting part of Callen's Instagram video came when he stated he would be taking a leave of absence from his podcast. This reversal of position, combined with the fact that Bryan never delivered the emergency Saturday night podcast, has led some people to believe that Brendan Schaub shot the idea down. This speculation was later furthered by a few pieces of circumstantial evidence. The first being the removal of Bryan Callen's name from the description of the Fighter and the Kid podcast. Even though Bryan stated he was taking a leave of absence from the podcast, removing his name seemed a bit extreme. Another interesting tidbit came during an episode of TFATK co-hosted by Josh Wolf. During the opening of the episode, Brendan talked about the situation with Bryan and made a few very peculiar comments. The one that really stands out to me was when Brendan said that the Fighter and the Kid was his baby and he's never missed an episode. This is demonstrably false. In fact, the most viewed episode of the podcast on YouTube is an episode without Brendan. Moreover, the comment seems really unnecessary to mention when Brendan is supposedly trying to defend his friend, and it indicates to me that there might be a more serious rift growing between them than they're letting on. But Brendan did defend Bryan, which is more than you can say about almost anyone in his circle. Even more so than with the Chris D'Elia accusations, comedians have been eerily quiet in regards to Bryan Callen, a fact that is pretty poetic when you remember how readily Callen distanced himself from Chris D'Elia. But Bryan's weak attempt to acknowledge the Chris D'Elia accusations has been more than Bryan has received from his own friends. Notably, Joe Rogan's omerta-like silence on the accusations made against D'Elia and Callen has been quite peculiar. With D'Elia, you can potentially make the argument that he wasn't a close part of Rogan's circle. However, Rogan has known Bryan Callen for 25 years and referred to him as being like a brother. More importantly, Joe has mentioned Bryan's debauchery on multiple occasions, like the time he gleefully brought up Callen's involvement in a weird, anonymous, eyes wide shut style orgy, or when he told Eric Weinstein the story of setting his ex-girlfriend up with Bryan, only to have her angrily call him back to say that Bryan came on her without consent. Dicey. As I've watched this story develop, one of the biggest questions I've been contemplating is whether or not Rogan will even address this situation. At this point, enough time has passed, and he's missed so many opportunities to speak on the situation, that it seems safe to assume that Joe will give Bryan the Chris Benoit treatment and act like he never existed. It doesn't appear that Callen will make this task easy for Rogan though, because Bryan is committed to this idea of not laying low. Fortunately, for the sake of unintentional comedy, he's doing it in the most embarrassing way possible. This is where we come to the part of the story that is still ongoing, and may change by the time the video was released. After Bryan took his leave of absence from The Fighter and the Kid, Brendan attempted a brief run without him. Unsurprisingly, the episodes with Brendan and a co-host were met with increasingly negative feedback. So, on August 12th, Brendan and Bryan announced that they would be releasing episodes of The Fighter and the Kid from behind a paywall on Patreon. Strangely, the Instagram post announcing their move to Patreon was deleted shortly after it was posted. Much like Bryan's tweet mentioning an emergency Saturday night episode of The Fighter and the Kid, this deleted post was a cause of much speculation. What I imagine happened was that Brendan and Bryan thought they could just do additional episodes of the podcast behind a paywall, but these dummies didn't bother to run that idea by their partners or sponsors. I came to this conclusion because when contacted by the LA Times, Cast Media, the company that represented The Fighter and the Kid, stated that they were no longer working with Bryan Callen. So these two did the most logical thing anyone would do in this situation. They created a new show called The Fighter and the Rinks and put it on Patreon. I'm not kidding. I'd almost feel embarrassed for Callen. You know, if he wasn't an avaristic ghoul who was willing to put people's lives at risk by doing stand-up comedy during a pandemic. But Jesus, this is embarrassing. Imagine being so cucked that not only do you let this bandana-wearing lummox do your podcast without you and pocket all of the sponsorship money, but you also change the name of your show so you can continue riding his coattails for some shekels on Patreon. When you realize how greedy these two are, it's no surprise that Callen is already doing the right-wing grifter routine. The day after the creation of The Fighter and the Rinks, Callen appeared on Louder with Crowder to peddle the same tired bullshit we hear from every intellectual dark web wannabe. He whined about cancel culture and the lack of due process for people accused of sexual misconduct, but he was also careful not to say exactly why he was being forced to reprise his podcast behind a paywall. He wants people to believe that he's being silenced or deplatformed, but that isn't the case. In the past, I've made a few videos where I've taken a stance against cancel culture and deplatforming, but this isn't what is happening with Callen. He hasn't been kicked off SNL like Shane Gillis, nobody has tried to excommunicate him from comedy as they did with Louis C.K., he hasn't had any of his accounts banned or his livelihood taken away. What happened was, the sponsors don't want to be associated with a guy accused of sexual misconduct, and Cast Media probably told Callen to pound sand. While I disagree with that decision from an ethical standpoint, it's just the way the free market works, and it's the same thing Bryan did when D'Elia was accused. Callen can complain until he's blue in the face about no one sticking up for the accused because they don't want to be cancelled too, but what did he do when his friend of 15 years was accused? He wasn't out there in the streets defending D'Elia's reputation, he pretended they never toured together and then deleted any trace of their friendship from his social media, like a coward. That comes back to the heart of the issue I brought up in my video about the Crystal Lee accusations. I said that incident could spell the death of the circle of comedians that has grown up around Joe Rogan, and I think we're seeing that schism manifest itself now. If you're familiar with the origins of all these people, you'll know that most of them are cowardly opportunists who only work together because they were able to form a group that exerted a tremendous amount of control over the comedy scene around them. They're often viewed as the antithesis of the New York comedy scene, because they've tried to portray their clique as working together instead of tearing each other down. The difference is, the comedians who shit on each other at the back table of the Comedy Cellar were actually friends. The crew that orbits Rogan only pretended to be friends because the relationship is politically convenient. But when push comes to shove, we've seen how willing they are to throw one of their own under the bus. Just think about it like this. Callen had to Skype into Louder with Crowder instead of going on the biggest podcast in the world, hosted by his friend of 2.5 decades. Rogan had Alex Jones, and racist, self-professed pedophile Anthony Cumia on his show, but not the guy he referred to as being like a brother to him. How awkward must that conversation have been? Do you think Joe even bothered to come up with an excuse about the Spotify deal and waiting a few months until he had the Austin studio up and running? Or did he just let Bryan's calls go to voicemail? It's not just Joe either. Joey Diaz moved to New Jersey, Theo Von is moving too. Without Callen to hold him back, Shaw is going to chase Rogan to Texas like Afterbirth. The faction lines are already being drawn, and it will be very interesting to see how this all plays out in the coming months. And this is about where I was going to end the video, before we got another unbelievable update to the story. On August 20th, a week after starting the Patreon for The Fighter and the Rinks, Bryan Callen posted a special message saying forces beyond their control are preventing them from doing The Fighter and the Rinks. Furthermore, Bryan announced he was going to be doing 2 new podcasts, the first being a podcast debunking conspiracy theories with Sam Tripoli, called Conspiracy Social Club, and the second being the Callen Report, where Bryan gives his hot takes on current events. Real original, Bri. When I said earlier that Callen was doing the right-wing grifter routine, I didn't think he was going to rip off the most middle-of-the-road member of the intellectual dark web. Now we'll finally get to hear the unfiltered opinions of the man who thinks Candace Owens is a deep thinker, and caught COVID on his first stand-up set after months of pretending the virus was a hoax. Actually, now that I think about it, I might have to listen to this podcast just for the unintentional hilarity of Big Brain Bryan pretending to be knowledgeable about politics because his dad was a CFR banker and he knows how to pronounce Afghanistan. If he just learns how to drop some rap battle bars in my head top, this podcast will be complete. That being said, the news hasn't been so well received by the fans of The Fighter and the Kid. Almost every new episode of the podcast has been getting a 50-50 or worse like to dislike ratio, and people are making their displeasure known. It seems like they finally realized they've been bamboozled. Callen and Schaub said they would be doing a new podcast, and they got people to fork over $35,000 for one episode of The Fighter and the Rinks, and a message from Bryan saying they can't do the podcast anymore. I think Hanlon's razor is accurate in most situations, but it's rare to see somebody make so many bad decisions in such a short amount of time. The forces beyond their control have to be either Cast Media or Showtime. And either Cast Media is saying that they'll stop sponsoring The Fighter and the Kid if Brendan and Bryan do a show on Patreon, or Showtime has stepped in and said they'll axe Brendan shows if he keeps working with Bryan. Maybe both. Either way, I have a hard time believing that even these certified dipshits could make the exact same mistake twice in a row by not running the idea of The Fighter and the Rinks past their sponsors and other affiliates. Then again, these geniuses thought they could get away with doing the same show behind a paywall just by changing the name. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit. Hey guys, have you tried buying a really big trench coat and having Brendan sit on Bryan's shoulders? He wouldn't be carrying any more weight than usual. What is more worrisome about this debacle is the possibility that it was planned. I can buy that these two are stupid, but after the way they distance themselves from D'Elia, I can't believe that they have courage or principles. I mean, what makes more sense to you? They actually believe that they could do the same show behind a paywall and there will be no ramifications from the sponsors? Or they started a Patreon and played the "we're being silenced" card to create a grassroots movement of support for the bait and switch of Bryan's two new podcasts? Maybe I'm giving them too much credit again. Whether it's stupidity, incompetence, malice, greed, or cowardice, these two have been making absolute asses of themselves for several weeks, and it shows no sign of stopping. However you feel about Callen, his career seems to be officially over. His prank show with Chris D'Elia has been cancelled by Netflix, which was admittedly more because of Chris, but it certainly doesn't help. He's been kicked off his own podcast, and his attempt to do another backup podcast behind a paywall was shut down by sponsors. He's been dropped by his talent agency, and the life preserver he's clinging to is a wobbly table and poorly researched conspiracy theories. Even without going into the divorce or the Corona Chronicles, the end of The Fighter and the Kid and the fall of Bryan Callen has been a wild ride. As always, I'd like to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. I know that more shit will come out after I publish this video, and as I said in the D'Elia video, I'll keep an eye on these events, and if enough interesting stuff comes out, I'll make a follow-up video. But for now, I think I'm done with this subject for a little while. If you'd like to support the channel, check out my Twitter and Patreon, and a big thank you to my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you, Jordan Fizzo, Joshua Renfrey, Dirtbag Thor, Erica Hughes, Tex Punch'em, Bart Wackenar, Josh G. Grows Mids, Dan Thomas, Mike Roballs, Colin Donahue, Bone CK, James Taylor, Mechanical Junkie, Ryan, Dalton Wyndham, Nikos Spiridakis, Tamby Helmick, The Son of Man, Neem, Kevin Howard, Medication Doesn't Work, and Jackie.